Welcome everyone, welcome to this video lecture. My name is Anna Beitene and I'm a coordinator of the MOOC. So after covering the EU's perspective on Eastern Partnership, during this week we are going to look at Russia's positions and reaction to the launch of Eastern Partnership. And to help us to uncover these topics, I'm very glad to introduce our guest speakers, our lecturers, Gor Petrosyan and Ryhor Nizhnikau. And just a couple of words about our speakers, of course. First, Mr. Gor Petrosyan, who is a political scientist from Armenia. He's also a research fellow at the Caucasus Institute, a think tank based in Armenia, and he's a lecturer at Yerevan State University. And we are also happy to have our second guest, Dr. Ryhor Nizhnikau, a senior research fellow in the EU's Neighbourhood and Russia program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And he also acquired his doctoral degree here at the University of Tartu and specializes in EU's Eastern Neighbourhood, Russia's policy in post-Soviet space, domestic and foreign policies of Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. So thank you for being with us and sharing your perspectives. And I would like to start our discussion with a little bit broader picture and perhaps first address question to Ryhor, but of course Gor is happy, feel free to jump in. As we know, initially initially the EU was not against the inclusion of Russia in its framework for neighborhood. However, as we know, Russia kind of insisted and opted for a bit more exclusive, separate framework for development of its bilateral relations with the European Union in the form of 4 common spaces. And on the basis of these developments, how can we evaluate Russia's understanding of and position towards the European neighborhood policy and how this changed since then? And a follow-up question, how has Ukraine's and Moldova's recent candidate status affected or changed the status quo? So please, Ryhor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Well, first of all, Russia-EU relations have changed really considerably in the last 20 years. And the change in perception and attitude of the European Neighbourhood Policy, as well as in specifically Eastern Partnership, has been at the core of it. The first point is that, of course, Russia itself never saw itself a part of the European Neighbourhood Policy. And there are several reasons. One of them, obviously, is the question of international prestige. Russia would never agree to be on the same level as countries like Ukraine or Georgia. Of course, Russia saw itself equal to the European Union, and that's why it wanted to have a rather symmetric framework of cooperation. And of course, even if ENP was created to be a substitute to the membership perspective, it's also a case where many ENP members, they sought and still seek membership in the European Union. And this was never a case for Moscow. Moscow was never seriously considering itself becoming a part of the European Union as one of the member states. So in this regard, Russia never really seriously considered ENP from the beginning. However, we do see that the attitude to the ENP has been changing, which actually drove EU-Russia relations from, let's say, cooperation to competition, specifically in the common neighborhood, to conflict and potentially even a direct clash in the foreseeable future, which is obviously a worst-case scenario. And one of the major points is that Russia denied what ENP in principle offered, a right for peoples in the neighborhood to decide and determine on their own future, whether they want to be not only on geopolitical future, but also just on domestic politics. And in this regard, the fact that basically the Eastern Partnership in eyes of Moscow became a geopolitical entity, geopolitical, let's say, threat to Moscow, has been one of the drivers of the more hostile attitude to the EU's policies as well as to the ENP as a framework in general. And in this respect, I would say the fact that now Moldova and Ukraine did receive this candidate status doesn't change much, because this is something that, even if this has been this result has been delivered in unique and tragic circumstances, and primarily which explain why this decision has been made, for the European Union that was never seriously on the table. We do understand that the EU has the enlargement fatigue. They also know that we see what happens in the Western Balkans. We also know that the EU considers neither Ukraine nor Moldova ready for even for candidate status. So that's basically decision is driven by a different logic. But in Moscow's eyes, it was always the case. Moscow's always saw that this is what actually the EU wants. This is what really threatens Russia's interest, because it takes away these countries from what Russia considers to be its own geopolitical backyard. And that's what Moscow mistakenly and wrongly, but still quite consistently thought and perceived of the ENP policies.
Thank you, Ryhor. If there are no kind of interventions, then I think my next question kind of nicely follows this discussion and an evolution that you also mentioned in regard to Russia's initial reaction and perceptions of European neighborhood policy. And in this regard, I would like to ask next question to Gor. And we can also kind of argue that Eastern Partnership initiative that was launched in 2009 is kind of a spin-off program that emerged under the umbrella of this European Neighbourhood Policy. And in this regard, what has been Russia's initial reaction and position towards the Eastern Partnership? And how can we see in some ways that, can we argue that Russia in a way tried to counterbalance the following initiative with its own alternative regional projects, and how the war in Ukraine changed the situation, perhaps? So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for interesting questions, actually. Well, first of all, about the establishment of Eastern Partnership, we need to look at the time and the relation of Russia with European Union back at that time. Starting from the preparation of the Eastern Partnership program was coinciding with the five-day war in Georgia. So the relations with European Union were quite tightened back at that time. And the perception of the Eastern Partnership program was more more a threat from the Russia's prospect, which would have negative geopolitical consequences. And Russia itself was perceiving the Commonwealth of Independent States as its own zone of influence, and it was not acceptable for Russia any geopolitical intervention to this zone back at that time. And also coming back to, but also about the Eastern Partnership countries, there was another perception that the European Union will not be able to integrate all the states because the region itself was too much fractured. The economy of Belarus was much more linked to Russia. In the South Caucasus, there is an Armenian-Azerbaijani war, and back at that time, Russia had their role, which because of geographic position, Russia had a role that no other country used to have. So all of this was making the perception of the Eastern Partnership on one hand as a threat, but on another hand, in the beginning of the of the program, it was not taken too much seriously. But there are also technical parts which I would like to say about. Well, first of all, from the prospect of Russia, the association with European Union meant that disassociation with Russia of the economies of all these countries, and also political disassociation with Russia. And which would, of course, complicate its further integration with Russia's economy. And then also it was perceived that the further programs which would be initiated by Russia would not be successful because of this integration. So from the Russia's prospect, it was not so much became not acceptable. And of course, there was another technical part that the Eastern Partnership undermines the law regulatories and technical regulations with Russia, and undermining and showing no respect to Russia. So, what was the Russia's prospect? It was that okay, we need to have a common space for talk, for integration, for economic integration, but this shouldn't undermine Russia's role. And also, as Ryhor mentioned, there was also the ambition to look like an equal with the European Union. In this regard, it was from the Russia's prospect, there was this need for another to be in a to construct its relations with European Union with its own institutions or unions. The CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, was the initial version, but it was not a workable mechanism. And also there were countries which were not in Eastern Partnership. So there was need to establish another mechanism from the Russia's prospect, and to speak to European Union as equal. And this was the customs union, which was I wouldn't say, maybe it was created not just as a counterbalance, but to become an equal with the European Union and to be in a relation with the European Union as equal. Without this, the Eastern Partnership was looked without Russia's engagement into their relations. The Eastern Partnership program was viewed more or less like a Guam program, and it was perceived as a program which was anti-Russian and which was undermining Russia's role in the region.
All right.
And yeah, becoming to the last question, I already forgot to speak about it. I think the situation has changed a lot since 2013, because back in 2013 there was also another cultural part. Back in 2013, the Vilnius summit and the rhetoric of Vilnius summit, the civilization, about the civilizational choice and etc. All of this was leading also to some more resentment in Russia. Now, when there is a war ongoing in Ukraine, the Ukraine itself has changed a lot, and the relations with between Russia and Ukraine have changed. The trade turnout has been cut it up to 80% even in 2021. From 46 billion, if I am not mistaken, up to 10, and their situation in South Caucasus has changed also a lot. And Russia sees that Azerbaijan doesn't want to go to European Union, doesn't have institutional or political will to go there. Armenia doesn't have any geographic or geopolitical source to go to European Union. Well, about Georgia, European Union is not ready to accept it. And now we are speaking just about the role of Moldova and Ukraine. And when it comes to Ukraine, well, officially the president of Russian Federation was telling in June, if I'm not mistaken, that, well, Russia is ready to allow Ukraine to go to European Union. But it's not known in which sizes, with which borders, and what kind of burden this will be for the European Union economically to take, and will it be possible to take this economic burden, and also to fulfill all the requirements for joining the European Union. So I think for now the perception in general has changed from what was there in 2009, but still Russia looks at the European Partnership Program as a competitor for its interest, and when it was saying that this is a red line for us and that without Russia's participation it will be impossible to fulfill the integration process, he was serious.
Any counter arguments or something to complement on in regard to Gor's arguments?
No, it was very comprehensive answer and overview of the situation in principle. So I would largely agree, and definitely we have to understand that Moscow's as well as the EU's perspective has been always changing, and much has been dependent also on let's say sometimes very major events in the region. And I'm not talking only about the Russian invasion, the first Russian invasion in 2014, as well as the Euromaidan, or even previously the Orange Revolution, which I would consider has been the first wake-up call for Moscow, seeing that it's actually should not be taken for granted that its influence and role in the region is solid and will remain as it is, and that they really should start competing for preserving and potentially expanding its role in the region. And the same comes to the way how Russia actually utilized different interregional or regional organization that it set up, because obviously the customs union was some kind of an answer. Then we obviously see Eurasian Economic Union set up exactly as the EU actually has been set up, with the same mimicking a lot of institutional, organizational, other things within. But the problem is that obviously the fact that there is always a contradiction, not only within the countries, but also within Moscow, within Kremlin, on how actually to use, what are the goals, lead to dysfunctionality. And I would argue one important factor, obviously, is that for Moscow, it was always rather a reaction to what the EU is doing, or to what happens on the ground in, let's say, Kiev or Chisinau, than a part of a long-term strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I still would like to continue and stick to the topic of Eastern Partnership and delve maybe a little bit deeper into specific member states in that regard. And we can, of course, still come back to this whole topic of competing regionalisms in that regard, and how EU and Russia try to propose different regional models of integration. But nevertheless, going back to my initial point, I would like to discuss the case of Belarus, of course. Belarus is the first country to kind of officially withdraw from Eastern Partnership. And in that regard, can we really argue that that was something rather surprising, or that was expected, considering kind of disengagement with this framework? And what has been EU's reaction in that regard? What would you expect in the long-term implication, if we can speak of long-term, considering the current developments of Ryhor? Gor, also feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I would underline a few things. The first one is that the Belarusian, let's say, suspension of Belarus in the Eastern Partnership underlines the artificial character and contradictory character of Eastern Partnership as initiative, because we have 6 rather different countries with different goals. Some, like Ukraine, ingrained European integration in their constitutions and really strive to become members of the European Union. Others are like Belarus, are really, as we see, the only ally of Moscow. Some members fight with each other, like Armenia and Azerbaijan. And obviously, the EU has really, and basically the Eastern Partnership satisfies no one. So we actually, before even Belarus announced its withdrawal, we see that Belarus has been really unhappy with the way Eastern Partnership was functioning, seeing it as a locomotive of, let's call it, autocratic modernization, something that Moscow benefited in, let's say, early 2000s. For countries like Moldova and Ukraine, Eastern Partnership was an empty, meaningless organization because they actually want membership. They want to deepen, not basically deepen the character of relations. And for them, Eastern Partnership was, let's say, a waste of time. So they always wanted more differentiation, more basically meaningful mechanisms and instruments of developing ties with the EU that could help them to bring to the goal of becoming the members. Of course, the question how much the elites wanted that is another story, but we see that this at least has been at the top of the priorities. And the war, the current war, the current Russian invasion, only, I think, puts to Brussels some kind of a very direct question. What is the future of Eastern Partnership? What do you see? And that actually is a kind of an existential dilemma, because we see that, again, with the candidate status of Ukraine and Moldova, for them Eastern Partnership becomes a bit of a meaningless, for sure. There are now will be different mechanisms, different instruments, how these countries will develop their ties. Belarus is suspended, so there is no cooperation. So we are left with basically Caucasian countries. And unfortunately, Caucasus, South Caucasus, was never a priority for the EU, and also not a priority for Eastern Partnership. And some may argue that somehow it was, if I may say so, these countries appeared in this initiative, in the ENP in principle, somehow by rather a mistake than were a part of a consistent and coherent strategy of Brussels. And the fact that we have this dilemma is somehow faces a big problem that Brussels doesn't still realize that. Brussels still thinks that EAP works well, that it has future as it is, and that's a gap between reality and vision in Brussels basically is one of the big dangers for the future of EAP, which needs reform.
Any
I would
response?
like to couple of remarks. Just I will start from the end. It's about the sources that the European Union and the Brussels has for the South Caucasus. First of all, we have seen 4 mediation meetings. The last one ended with another escalation. So it means that sometimes in Brussels they are overestimating the sources that they have to mediate the conflicts that exist in the region, and this is out of reality. And there is another source for the integration, and this is financial source. And starting from the financial crisis in 2008, with the beginning of the Eastern Partnership program, the financial situation of the European Union was not improving, but it was, but vice versa. And also with the Brexit and other movements in European Union, the illusion of joining the European Union soon in the South Caucasus is getting lost. And also I think that it's getting lost cost for some Eastern partner countries as well. The fate of Ukraine is not known yet, and they don't know whether in how many years or how many decades will the Ukraine be able to become a member state of European Union, or will there be a will by the European countries to issue a membership to Ukraine. So those are all under questions, and indeed I would agree with colleague that in Brussels the role of Eastern Partnership is too much overestimated currently, and its functionality is overestimated as well. And another one, I just forget to mention about the financial sources. There is also resentment when the European Union is saying that we will provide some financial aid to one of the Eastern Partnership countries. You always have some frustration from other countries. Why they will get so much, we will not get. The same is about Georgia, which was consistently implementing all the necessary fulfillments, but it was not given an candidacy status, while Moldova at the same time was given. So there is some kind of frustration, and there is need to format the Eastern Partnership program in order to make it more functional or to make it in different way, let's say.
And if I may, just one
Yes,
thing,
of course.
because obviously what Gor just mentioned is exactly one important part of a problem, looking at it from a different side, which is that even if there've been a lot of frustrations, as I talked before, in the EAP capitals, we must admit that for them, Eastern Partnership was a sort of a window dressing, because EAP as the multilateral mechanism, as well as different bilateral formats, were used actually as a kind of a, for some countries as a tool to imitate reforms. They received money with somehow weak conditionality, which they can actually show to their pro-European constituencies that, look, we are integrating, we are on the path towards closer ties, and look what we have achieved, while reforms were really sometimes being stalled or even backsliding. While for some countries like Belarus, that was also a very nice tool to, for instance, be able to use it as a bargaining chip in their relations with Moscow, or as the critical engagement in 2015-2020 was partially used for actually broadening the legitimacy of the regime domestically among, again, population which considered Belarus as, or let's say considered closer ties with Europe as an important function or element of the state foreign policy for them. And in this regard, this sort of a window dressing function of EAP after the war erupted is no longer should be accepted by Brussels itself.
And yeah, I think we also kind of had a very nice still overview of how, again, EU acts as an actor, and it's a very interesting topic that we will also uncover in the last weeks of the course in regard to the whole future of Eastern Partnership. But I'm also happy that we highlighted these kind of divisions or kind of competition inside the Eastern Partnership countries itself. But going back still to Russia's perception and role in this regard, and kind of a little bit to wrap up our discussion, I would like to ask the last question, and mostly to Gor, but again, Ryhor, feel free to jump in. The developments that we are now witnessing in the region, it's unfortunately we cannot say that this is in a way the turbulence didn't happen before. We can see this in regard to Maidan revolution in 2013-14, and then Velvet Revolution in Armenia, and well, also protests in Belarus over the last years. So there has been this turbulence But still, of course, events like war, this is something that quite a dramatic event. And in that regard, I wanted to ask how the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, perhaps changed Russian perception of Eastern Partnership and its perspective on EU potential enlargement in that regard. So if we could still maybe continue that conversation that we initially started in the course.
Yeah, and I would also like to try to link this with the revolutions, because I think that from the Russia's viewpoint, the revolutions in the Eastern Partnership countries are viewed differently than they are viewed from the European Union. For Russia, as much as it's more important to have bilateral relations with all the countries, the different revolutions were perceived differently as well. Well, the agenda of the Euromaidan was clear for Russia, and it was perceived as a potential threat to its interests. But when it came to the Velvet Revolution in Armenia, the situation was quite different. For Russia, this was another opportunity to have new relations, because it was not so much satisfied with the policy that the previous leadership of Armenia was conducting, which was double integration with Russia and the comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement with European Union on the other hand. And in Russia, in Kremlin, they knew that whoever comes to power in Armenia, if it doesn't have any suicidal inclinations, it will at least follow the line that was already established. And what we have seen, that was that current leadership of Armenia was just trying to deepen its relations with Russia as well. This we are in public perception. Maybe there were some other discourses as well in Russia television and etc. When it comes to Belarus, the perception was a little bit different, because of the Belarus's leadership was also before the before 2020, they were trying kind of to manipulate or to imitate a competition between European Union and between Russia. Just let's not forget that right before the movement started in Belarus, the leadership was trying also to manipulate Russia again back at that time, saying that we will deepen our integration with European Union. Now, when the war in Ukraine is going, and not just the Ukrainian war, but also after the Nagorno-Karabakh second war in South Caucasus, the situation has become much more clearer for Russia, that in terms of Azerbaijan, it doesn't want to be to integrate itself with European Union, but it is trying to kind of have double relations. Let's not forget that a day prior to Russia's invasion to Ukraine, Azerbaijan signed a strategic partnership agreement in energetic sources with Russia. But on the other hand, we also see that Azerbaijan's leadership is signing the same kind of agreements with the European Union as well, trying to get the best for itself and not trying to integrate with one of the sides too deeply. But at the same time, having more integration with Turkey, which is another serious player in the region for now.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to also intervene?
I totally agree with Gor's analysis, and I would underline probably one important thing is that, first of all, of course, revolutions played a really key role in Russia's re-evaluation or evolution of Russia's policies, both towards EU's initiative in the region, but also towards the countries. Because as the Orange Revolution changed Moscow perception in 2004, obviously Euromaidan, and both actually had primarily domestic drivers with obviously some geopolitical coloring, but they were, and Russia, unfortunately, Russia perceived it very differently as somehow a Western encroaching on its interests. But what we can actually see is that and this is, I think, a dramatic change after the February 2022. What in 2000s Russia rather saw as an exemption in its policies, which still tried to rather co-opt the elites and used, let's say, war, like in Georgia, as rather a unique and exception in its policies, now becomes a practice. And this is a massive change, because we definitely see that neither co-optation nor even coercion as such, political or economic, are seen as primary tools in Russia's policies in the neighborhood. And the war becomes the key element of it. And that's why everyone in the Eastern Partnership or even beyond, like Kazakhstan, feel threatened by Moscow, because they see that this Moscow's current policy has no limits anymore.
Absolutely, and I think in that regard also what Gor highlighted in his remarks, I found rather interesting about kind of Russia's now current role in the region itself, because besides kind of, let's say, hard power, one of the attractions of Eastern Partnership and European Neighbourhood Policy is the whole dimension of soft power, right? All the normative values, that's something that we kind of associate European Union with. And in this regard, as Ryhor pointed out, war as a practice or kind of one of the tools in the toolkit could be rather threatening for the countries that might somewhat be closer, let's say, to Russia's sphere of influence, if we can use this in our vocabulary. But nevertheless, thank you for highlighting all these trends. I hope that students also found it interesting, and that this could also kind of be a fertile ground for further discussions in the course. So thank you.